Picture this. You work your ass off for 25 years as a city water engineer, dealing with broken pipes, flooded basements, and politicians who wouldn't know a water main from a sewer line. You save every penny, skip vacations, drive the same beat-up truck for a decade, all for one dream: owning a piece of lakefront paradise where you can finally watch the sunrise over water that belongs to you. That dream became reality when I bought 2.3 acres of pristine lakefront property on Crystal Lake, complete with 200 feet of private shoreline that I could walk barefoot on every morning with my coffee, listening to nothing but lapping waves and my own thoughts. I'm Marcus Thompson, 52 years old, and I earned every square inch of that property through blood, sweat, and overtime pay that would make a workaholic jealous. My background in municipal water systems meant I understood exactly what waterfront property was worth, and more importantly, I knew every zoning law, easement regulation, and property right that protected my ownership. I'd researched this land for months, hired 3 different surveyors to confirm the boundaries, and made damn sure my deed was bulletproof with legal descriptions so precise they could find my property line with a magnifying glass. Now, let me introduce you to the absolute villain of this story, Karen Whitfield, our 45-year-old HOA president, and the kind of woman who makes you understand why some people believe in evil. Karen looked like she'd stepped out of a real estate magazine photo shoot. Perfectly highlighted blonde hair that never moved in the wind, designer clothes that cost more than most people's car payments, and a smile so artificially white it could blind pilots from 30,000 feet. But underneath that polished exterior lived the soul of a dictator who treated our neighborhood like her personal kingdom, and every resident like a peasant who needed her permission to breathe. This woman had turned being a control freak into an Olympic sport, inserted herself into every aspect of community life with the subtlety of a bulldozer in a flower garden. She hosted mandatory coffee mornings where she'd lecture us about proper lawn maintenance, organized neighborhood watch meetings that were really just gossip sessions about who was violating her arbitrary standards, and sent passive-aggressive notes about everything from mailbox heights to the acceptable colors for outdoor furniture. Karen had convinced herself that being HOA president made her some kind of elected queen with divine authority over property that didn't belong to her. While I was visiting my elderly mother in Arizona for 3 weeks, helping her recover from hip surgery like any decent son would do, Karen struck like a venomous snake that had been waiting for the perfect moment to bite. Under the banner of enhancing community wellness and promoting neighborhood unity, she made a unilateral decision that would have made Stalin proud. She declared my private lakefront property a community beach area, complete with an official HOA announcement that I never received because I was 1,200 miles away caring for my family. But Karen didn't stop at empty announcements and feel-good press releases. This woman hired a landscaping crew to clear and improve my property, installing park benches, a fire pit, and even a wooden boardwalk that extended 30 feet into the lake, all without my knowledge, consent, or presence. She planted community flowers in my soil, spread fresh mulch over my grass, and erected a hand-painted wooden sign that read, "Crystal Lake Community Beach. Enjoy responsibly." The sign was crooked. The paint job looked like it was done by kindergartners. But Karen was so proud of her generosity with my property that she posted dozens of photos on the neighborhood Facebook page, tagging my name like she was daring me to object. When I pulled into my driveway after that long, peaceful drive from Arizona, the silence was immediately shattered by what sounded like a music festival mixed with a daycare center riot. My private lakefront had been transformed into a public beach complete with families grilling hamburgers on portable barbecues, teenagers playing volleyball on sand they'd imported onto my property, and unsupervised children using my dock as a diving platform while their parents sat in lawn chairs drinking beer like they were at a resort they'd paid to visit. I counted 37 people spread across my land. Strangers who'd set up camp with umbrellas, coolers, inflatable rafts, and enough recreational equipment to stock a sporting goods store. Someone had actually installed a rope swing on my century-old oak tree, and kids were launching themselves into the lake, while parents cheered and took videos like they were watching their children perform at Carnegie Hall instead of trespassing on private property. I walked outside carrying my folder of legal documents, property deed, survey maps, title insurance, and HOA covenants that clearly define my boundaries and rights. The contrast was surreal. Official papers with raised seals and legal descriptions proving this was my private property, and a crowd of trespassers treating it like a public park that existed for their entertainment. When I politely approached the nearest group and explained that this was private property, they literally laughed in my face like I was telling them the moon was made of cheese. "Lady Karen gave us permission," said a woman in a bikini worth more than my monthly grocery budget. "This is community property now, and the HOA voted to make it accessible to everyone. You can't be selfish about waterfront access when you have so much space." A teenage boy actually had the nerve to pull out his phone and start recording me, adding commentary about how I was being difficult and trying to ruin everyone's fun like I was some kind of villain for wanting to use my own property. The disrespect and entitlement was so thick you could cut it with a knife. These people genuinely believed that Karen had the authority to give away land that didn't belong to her, and that community spirit meant stealing whatever they wanted from their neighbors as long as they called it sharing. I felt my blood pressure rising as the reality sank in. I was being robbed in broad daylight by people who thought they had official permission to steal. I marched straight to the HOA office, a converted garage space that Karen had decorated like a corporate boardroom with furniture that probably cost more than most people's annual salary. Karen greeted me with that poisonous fake smile and said, "Oh, Marcus, you're back. Isn't it wonderful how our community has come together? Your property has become the heart of neighborhood unity. You really should learn to share. Everyone deserves lake access, and your house has the best location." She actually showed me a petition with 43 signatures supporting the Community Beach Initiative, though I suspect a half of them are forgeries, and the other half came from people who had no idea they were signing approval for theft. Her eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of someone who thought they just pulled off the crime of the century, liberated my land from my selfish ownership for the greater good of people who contributed nothing toward a mortgage, property taxes, or maintenance costs. Talking to Karen was like trying to reason with a brick wall that had delusions of grandeur. I was insulted to my core by her complete dismissal of my legal rights and her arrogant assumption that she could redistribute private property like some kind of communist dictator in suburban clothing. I stood up, looked her directly in the eye, and said, "Karen, you made the biggest mistake of your miserable life. This won't stand, and when I'm done with you, you'll wish you'd never heard my name." She just smirked with a half-smile full of challenge, clearly thinking she held all the power in this situation, and that I was just another neighbor who would eventually bow down to her authority. I walked out of there knowing this was war, pulling out my phone to photograph that illegal sign on my property as evidence. The battle lines had been drawn, and Karen Whitfield had no idea she just picked a fight with someone who knew how to fight back harder than she could ever imagine. After my useless confrontation with Karen, I knew I needed legal firepower that could match her arrogance with actual authority. This wasn't some neighborhood disagreement that could be resolved with compromise and handshakes. This was a full-scale assault on my property rights that required the kind of legal response that would make Karen's fake smile disappear permanently. I found Rebecca Martinez, a property rights attorney with 15 years of experience dismantling HOA overreach and a reputation for making corrupt board members wish they'd chosen different hobbies. Rebecca spread my ownership documents across her desk like a general planning a military campaign. Property deed, survey maps, title insurance, and HOA covenants that clearly established my rights and Karen's complete lack of authority to give away what didn't belong to her. "She's not just wrong," Rebecca said after reviewing the evidence. "She's committed multiple felonies: theft, fraud, criminal trespass, and abuse of authority that could send her to prison if we push hard enough." We crafted a legal letter that was sharper than a surgeon's scalpel and more deadly than a sniper's bullet, giving Karen 7 days to remove every person, every improvement, and every trace of her illegal beach project or face a lawsuit that would bankrupt her family for 3 generations. The letter was a legal masterpiece that left no room for misinterpretation, excuses, or wiggling out of responsibility. It detailed every law she'd broken, every right she'd violated, and every consequence she'd face if she didn't immediately correct her criminal behavior. Rebecca hand-delivered that letter to Karen's mailbox like she was serving a death warrant, and we waited for her to come to her senses like any reasonable person would when faced with guaranteed legal destruction. But we seriously underestimated just how delusional and vindictive Karen could be when someone dared to challenge her imaginary authority. Instead of backing down like a normal person who'd been caught red-handed committing crimes, she doubled down on her stupidity and decided to fight back with everything she had, turning this property dispute into a neighborhood war that would make the Hatfields and McCoys look like a friendly disagreement. Karen called an emergency HOA meeting and turned it into a three-ring circus designed to humiliate me in front of the entire community. But here's the part that really showed her true colors. She live-streamed the whole thing on the neighborhood Facebook page, reading Rebecca's legal letter out loud like it was comedy material written specifically for her entertainment. I watched my name get dragged through the mud while she mocked my property rights like they were some kind of joke that only stupid people would take seriously. She twisted every word in that letter, telling her audience that I was being unreasonable and selfish, trying to sue the entire community over what she called a tiny strip of land that everyone should be able to enjoy. She painted herself as a champion of community spirit fighting against my greedy attempt to monopolize waterfront access, using every manipulation trick in the book to turn public opinion against me and make me look like the villain in her fictional narrative. Then Karen announced her master plan, an emergency amendment to HOA regulations that would give her the power to declare any property essential for community wellness and fine owners who refuse to share their resources. The penalty for non-compliance would be $500 per day plus legal fees, essentially creating a system where she could legally steal whatever she wanted and bankrupt anyone who objected to her theft. Some of my neighbors started acting like Karen's personal enforcers, throwing trash in my yard, playing loud music at all hours, and organizing protest parties right against my fence line to show their loyalty to Queen Karen and their contempt for my property rights. They removed my private property signs and replaced them with homemade banners that said, "Community Beach Access, Karen Approved," written in crayon like kindergarten art projects. Other neighbors were getting uncomfortable with how far this had escalated, especially when they saw Karen's willingness to destroy anyone who opposed her will. The unity she'd built through fear and manipulation started showing cracks, as people realized that if she could steal my property today, she could steal theirs tomorrow using the same twisted logic about community needs overriding individual rights. Rebecca stood up at the next meeting with the calm confidence of someone who knew the law inside and out, presenting my property documents and pointing out the obvious legal violations in Karen's proposed amendment. Her quiet professionalism made Karen's hysterical ranting look even more unhinged and desperate, like a toddler having a tantrum when told they couldn't have candy for dinner. The contrast couldn't have been more obvious. A competent attorney dealing with facts and law versus a corrupt politician dealing with emotions and manipulation. Rebecca's presentation was so devastating that several board members started distancing themselves from Karen's scheme, suddenly remembering that they could be held personally liable for supporting illegal activities that violated federal property rights laws. That's when I played my trump card, security camera footage of Karen and her supporters vandalizing my property, removing my signs, and encouraging trespassers to ignore my clearly posted boundaries. The video showed Karen's mask finally slipping as she directed people to make themselves at home on land that didn't belong to her, laughing about how I couldn't do anything to stop them. You could hear a pin drop as the footage played, and several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, probably wondering what other illegal activities their HOA president had been orchestrating without their knowledge. The video evidence made it impossible for anyone to pretend this was about community spirit instead of outright theft disguised as neighborhood improvement. The meeting erupted into chaos as people started demanding answers about other questionable decisions Karen had made over the years. Mysterious budget increases, no-bid contracts with companies connected to her family, and closed-door meetings that violated HOA transparency requirements. The unity Karen had built through intimidation crumbled in real time as residents realized they'd been played by a master manipulator who'd been using their trust to enrich herself at their expense. Karen slammed her gavel so hard it cracked, screamed something about ungrateful residents who didn't appreciate her leadership, and stormed out of the meeting with the dignity of a dictator fleeing a revolution. I sat calmly in my chair, knowing that the tide had finally turned in my favor, and that Karen had just made the biggest mistake of her pathetic life. Being cornered by Karen's propaganda machine and facing down her team of hired supporters, I knew I needed to find her weak spot if I was going to win this war. Legal letters and property documents weren't enough when she controlled the narrative and had convinced half the neighborhood that I was the bad guy for wanting to use my own land. I didn't waste time feeling sorry for myself. Instead, I used my 25 years of experience as a municipal engineer, someone who knew how to dig through technical documents, public records, and bureaucratic paperwork that most people ignored or didn't understand. I started investigating Karen and the HOA board like I was building a case of the FBI, looking for patterns, inconsistencies, and evidence of the corruption I was sure existed beneath her perfect community leader facade. I spent hours going through old HOA meeting minutes, financial records, and public documents that were supposed to be transparent, but were buried in legal jargon designed to hide important information from residents who paid the bills. The more I dug, the more suspicious patterns I found. Unusual expenses that didn't make sense, contract with companies that had connections to Karen's family, and decisions that seemed to benefit certain people more than the general community. That's when I approached Dorothy Chun, a retired accountant who'd been living in our neighborhood for 12 years and had been on Karen's bad side ever since she'd asked too many questions about HOA budget discrepancies during a board meeting. Dorothy had been quietly keeping her own records of financial irregularities, suspicious expenditures, and questionable business relationships that she'd noticed but had been afraid to challenge directly. When I explained my situation and showed her the evidence of what Karen had done to my property, Dorothy's eyes lit up like she'd been waiting years for someone to finally stand up to our corrupt HOA president. She disappeared into her home office and returned with a thick folder that would change everything. Detailed financial records showing a pattern of fraud, embezzlement, and kickback schemes that had been going on for years. This is what she didn't want anyone to see, Dorothy said quietly, sliding the folder across her kitchen table. The documents painted a picture of systematic corruption that made my property theft look like petty crime compared to the massive fraud Karen had been orchestrating since becoming HOA president. There were invoices for landscaping work that was never performed, legal fees that were triple the normal rate for services that were never provided, and maintenance contracts with companies that existed only on paper. But the real smoking gun was buried in the back of that folder. 2 different property maps of our neighborhood, both officially stamped and sealed by the county, but showing completely different boundary lines around the lake area. The older map, filed before Karen became HOA president, clearly showed my property extending all the way to the water, just like my deed specified. The newer map, mysteriously updated after Karen took power, showed those same lot lines altered to create a community access corridor right where my private shoreline used to be. Someone had been planning this theft for years, slowly changing official records to make it look legal when the time came to steal my waterfront. Dorothy also revealed that Karen had been in regular contact with a real estate development company called Lakefront Properties Incorporated, owned by her brother-in-law Karen Whitfield, who specialized in buying undervalued waterfront land and flipping it for massive profits. Phone records showed dozens of calls between Karen and Stephen, and Dorothy had discovered that Lakefront Properties had been quietly buying up other properties around Crystal Lake, always at prices well below market value from owners who'd been pressured by HOA fines, legal harassment, and community ostracism until they gave up and sold cheap. My property wasn't just stolen for community use. It was stolen to devalue enough that I'd be forced to sell to Stephen's company at a fraction of its real worth. The Community Beach Project was never about neighborhood unity or shared resources. It was about destroying my property value, making my land unusable for private purposes, and forcing me to sell to Karen's family at a price that would make them rich, while leaving me with pennies on the dollar for land I'd worked 25 years to afford. Dorothy looked at me across her kitchen table, her eyes filled with years of frustration at watching Karen get away with crimes that would have sent a normal person to prison. "Now you know what kind of person Karen Whitfield really is," she said quietly. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" I smiled for the first time in weeks, feeling the pieces of my counterattack falling into place. "Dorothy, I'm going to build something that will make her rue the day she decided to steal from me. But that's just the beginning. Before this is over, everyone will know exactly what kind of criminal Karen Whitfield really is." After collecting enough evidence to understand the full scope of Karen's corruption, I decided it was time to hit back with something she'd never expect. A perfectly legal, completely justified, and absolutely devastating counterattack that would make her regret every criminal decision she'd made since becoming our neighborhood dictator. I wasn't going to fight with words or legal papers anymore. I was going to use action, the kind of visual statement that would make every person in the community stop and think about what really happened here and who the real villain was in this story. My plan was brilliant in its simplicity. If Karen wanted to give away my lakefront access, I'd make sure nobody could access it, including her. I ran my fence idea past Rebecca Martinez, and she practically started laughing with joy. "Marcus," she said, "what you're planning is completely legal, totally justified, and absolutely brilliant. Build that fence, and make her choke on her own medicine. She can't steal what she can't reach, and property owners have every right to secure their boundaries against trespassers." I didn't mess around with some cheap chain-link fence that could be climbed over or cut through with bolt cutters. I invested in a fortress. Solid cedar planks 8 feet high, painted matte black for maximum visual impact, built exactly to property lines that my legal survey had established beyond any reasonable doubt. This wasn't just a fence. It was a monument to property rights and a physical declaration that some things in this world still belong to the people who paid for them. Every board was perfectly aligned. Every post was precisely measured with surveyor equipment, and every nail was driven with the accumulated anger of man who'd been pushed too far by people who thought they could take whatever they wanted. The construction crew worked like a military operation, showing up at dawn and finishing the entire project in a single day while Karen was out of town at one of her spa weekends, probably spending HOA money on massages while the rest of us dealt with her messes. The real masterpiece was a sign I mounted on that fence. Not some hand-painted wooden board like Karen's amateur production, but professional aluminum sign that cost me $300 and was worth every penny. It read, "Private property, lake access stolen by Karen Whitfield. Take it up with your HOA queen. Good luck." The message was short, sweet, and designed to drive her absolutely insane every time she read it. I also installed real security cameras, not fake ones like some people use, with motion sensors and night vision capabilities that would record every person who came near my fence. The combination professional signage, obvious surveillance, and 8 feet of solid barrier sent a clear message. This property was protected, monitored, and definitely not available for community theft. When Karen came home and saw my fence, she lost her mind in the most spectacular way possible. I watched the whole performance from my kitchen window while sipping coffee and enjoying the show like it was Sunday morning entertainment. She screamed like a banshee, threw herself against a fence gate, and rattled it like a caged animal trying to escape from a zoo that had suddenly gotten too small for her massive ego. She read my sign over and over, her face changing colors like a traffic light stuck on malfunction. Red with anger, white with shock, then purple with rage as the reality sank in that her community beach project had just become a useless strip of land that nobody could reach. Then she started yelling at my security cameras, pointing and waving her arms like she was having an argument with robots that refused to acknowledge her imaginary authority. The phone call started within an hour. Karen screaming into my voicemail about property violations, community spirit, and legal action, using language that would make a sailor blush and threatening to sue me, fine me, and have me thrown out of the neighborhood for being uncooperative and destructive to community harmony. I listened to each message with growing satisfaction, knowing that every word was just proof of how well my fence was working and how completely I destroyed her theft operation. Some neighbors were shocked by the sudden appearance of my fortress, especially the ones who'd been using my stolen lake access like it was their personal entertainment center. They complained about losing their free beach area, but their protests sounded pretty weak when they had to admit they'd been trespassing on private property that was never theirs to use in the first place. Other neighbors, the ones who'd been quietly uncomfortable with Karen's land grab but were too scared to speak up, started looking at my fence with respect and admiration. Dorothy gave me a thumbs up from her front yard and told anyone who would listen, "That fence is what justice looks like when corrupt officials think they can steal whatever they want." I kept my cool through all the drama, responding to Karen's threats with polite but firm reminders about property rights and legal ownership. When she demanded I tear down my fence, I suggested she contact the city planning office about building that community lake access she'd promised everyone. After all, surely the HOA could provide it on land they actually own instead of stealing it from private citizens. Karen finally realized she wasn't dealing with some pushover who'd roll over and play dead when she barked orders. My fence was more than just wood and posts. It was a declaration of war, a statement that some people won't be bullied no matter how much pressure you apply or how many official-sounding titles you hide behind. MY fence hit Karen, like a sledgehammer to the face, destroy her carefully planned theft operation, and making her look like a fool in front of the entire neighborhood. She couldn't handle the humiliation of being outmaneuvered by someone she dismissed as a harmless old man who would eventually give in to community pressure and accept the theft of his property. So she decided to escalate this conflict to nuclear levels, showing her true colors as a dangerous sociopath who'd rather burn down the entire community than admit she'd made a mistake or broken the law. Karen called an emergency HOA meeting with the desperation of a dictator facing a revolution, turning the community center into a kangaroo court designed to destroy my reputation and force me to tear down the fence that was protecting my stolen property. Karen's performance at that meeting was worthy of an Academy Award for Best Actress in a psychotic breakdown. She accused me of everything short of terrorism, destroying community unity, violating the sacred spirit of neighborly cooperation, and selfishly hoarding resources that belong to everyone, even though the resources in question were my private property that I'd paid for with 25 years of honest work. She waved her arms like a religious fanatic calling down divine judgment, her voice rising to a shriek as she painted me as the villain who was destroying everything good and pure about our neighborhood. Her face turned red, then purple, then a shade of green that made me worry she might actually have a stroke right there on stage in the middle of her dramatic monologue about my sins against humanity. That's when someone in the back of the room started playing barnyard animal sounds through a Bluetooth speaker. Pig grunts, rooster crows, and cow mooings that perfectly captured what most reasonable people thought about Karen's performance. She stopped mid-sentence, her mouth hanging open like a fish gasping for air, and demanded that security find the prankster immediately. But the sounds kept coming from a different part of the room, turning her moment of righteous fury into a comedy show that had half the audience trying not to laugh out loud. When she finally regained control of the meeting, Karen announced her master plan, an emergency amendment to HOA regulations that would give her the power to order the immediate removal of any structure that interfered with community access to shared resources. The fine for noncompliance would be $1,000 plus legal fees, plus forced removal at my expense. It was legalized extortion, plain and simple, designed to bankrupt me into submission or drive me out of the neighborhood entirely. But that's when Rebecca Martinez stood up with the quiet confidence of someone who knew the law inside and out. She calmly explained that Karen's proposed amendment violated federal property rights laws, state housing regulations, and about 15 different sections of the legal code that protect homeowners from exactly this kind of abuse by corrupt HOA officials. What Mrs. Whitfield is proposing, Rebecca said clearly, isn't just illegal, it's criminal conspiracy to commit theft under color of authority. Any board member who votes for this amendment will be personally liable for damages and could face criminal charges for participating in organized fraud. You could hear a pin drop as Rebecca's words sank in, and several board members started looking very uncomfortable as they realized they'd been about to vote themselves into prison sentences. The meeting started falling apart as people demanded to know what other illegal schemes Karen had been cooking up behind closed doors. That's when I played my nuclear option, audio recordings that Dorothy had made of Karen's private conversations with her brother-in-law Stephen about their property manipulation scheme. The recordings clearly showed Karen explaining how they'd been using HOA authority to devalue lakefront properties, force owners to sell cheap, then flip the land for massive development profits. Her own voice condemned her from the speakers, laying out the entire criminal conspiracy like she was reading a grocery list. The community's reaction was swift and brutal. People started shouting resign and criminal, while others demanded to know how much money she'd stolen over the years through fake contracts and inflated expenses. The HOA board members who'd been supporting Karen quickly distanced themselves, claiming they had no knowledge of her illegal activities and calling for her immediate resignation. Even more satisfying was watching Karen's supporters realize they'd been defending a criminal who'd been robbing them blind while pretending to serve their best interests. Karen tried to sneak out the back door, but someone had called the police, and she found herself facing questions about fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy that would follow her for the rest of her miserable life. The meeting ended with a unanimous vote of no confidence and demands for a full financial audit of HOA books that would expose years of corruption and theft. With Karen exposed as a criminal and her corrupt empire in ruins, the neighborhood finally had a chance to heal from years of her toxic leadership. The police investigation was just getting started, but everyone already knew she was finished. Her political career destroyed, her reputation in tatters, and her legal troubles just beginning. Dorothy was elected HOA president in an emergency vote, running unopposed on a platform of transparency, honesty, and basic human decency. The contrast couldn't have been more obvious. Where Karen had ruled through fear and manipulation, Dorothy promised open books, public meetings, and respect for property rights that would prevent any future power-hungry lunatic from stealing what didn't belong to them. Her first official act was to formally apologize to me on behalf of the entire community and to establish new policies requiring public votes for any expenditure over $200, monthly financial reports posted online, and criminal background checks for all board members. She also announced that all of Karen's illegal improvements on my property would be removed at HOA expense and that I would receive full compensation for damages, legal fees, and the violation of my property rights. The real satisfaction came when I spent a weekend reclaiming every inch of my stolen land, pulling up every stake Karen had driven into my soil, and erasing every trace of her fake community improvement project. I worked methodically, using my hand to undo the damage that had been done by someone who'd never worked an honest day in her life, removing her crooked signs and smoothing out the tire tracks where strangers had parked their cars on my grass. There was something deeply satisfying about the physical work, using the skills my father had taught me about protecting what's yours and standing up to bullies who think they can take whatever they want from hard-working people. When the cleanup was finished, I set up the wooden bench that had belonged to my dad, positioning it in the exact spot where I could watch the sunrise over the lake every morning while drinking coffee and enjoying the peace I'd worked 25 years to afford. The community organized a ceremony by the lake that was more meaningful than any legal victory I could have won in court. People who'd been my enemies just weeks before came up to shake my hand and apologize for believing Karen's lies about my character and motives. Some brought their children, teaching them about property rights and the importance of standing up to bullies who abuse their authority for personal gain. Mrs. Patterson, who'd been one of Karen's most vocal supporters, brought me a plate of homemade cookies and admitted she'd been wrong to trust someone who made grand promises while hiding criminal intentions. I should have known better, she said with tears in her eyes. But Karen made it sound so reasonable, so community-minded. I never thought to ask who was really benefiting from all her generous ideas with other people's property. Together, we planted a young oak tree by my fence as a symbol of growth, strength, and importance of standing up for what's right even when the whole world seems lined up against you. Every spring when new leaves appear, I'm reminded that some battles are worth fighting. Even when the odds seem impossible and corrupt officials think they can steal whatever they want from hard-working citizens. My fence still stands exactly where I built it, but it's no longer a symbol of conflict. It's become a symbol of victory, justice, and the American principle that your property belongs to you and nobody else. I replaced the sarcastic sign with a simple wooden plaque that I carved by hand in my garage, thinking carefully about each word and what it meant for future residents who might face similar challenges. The plaque reads, "This land stands protected. Property rights matter. Never again." It's a message for anyone who might think about pulling the same kind of theft Karen attempted. A reminder that some people won't be pushed around no matter how much pressure you apply or how many official-sounding titles you hide behind. Property values around the lake actually went up after Karen's removal, probably because potential buyers felt safer knowing they wouldn't have to deal with a corrupt HOA president who might steal their land for personal profit. Real estate agents started mentioning our transparent leadership and strong property rights protections in their listings, turning what could have been a scandal into a selling point that attracted families who valued honesty and integrity. My morning routine now includes walking around my reclaimed property with a cup of coffee, checking on the oak tree, and enjoying the peace and quiet that I paid for with decades of honest work. Neighbors wave and say hello. Children play safely by the water without trespassing on private property. And the lake reflects the sky like a mirror that's finally been cleaned of all the corruption that once clouded its surface. So that's my story of how one man's fence became a symbol of justice and proved that sometimes the best way to deal with a corrupt official is to build a wall they can't climb over, around, or through. Karen Whitfield learned the hard way that stealing from your neighbors has consequences, And I learned that standing up for your rights is worth whatever fight comes with it. The fence still stands, the tree grows taller every year, and life goes on exactly as it should in a community where people respect each other's property and rights. Justice isn't just about winning. It's about making sure the same injustice never happens to anyone else and creating a legacy that future generations can build upon. AS Stories is all about the wildest things real people go through, and we're just getting started. Like, share and stay tuned for more incredible tales of justice, revenge, and people who refuse to be pushed around by corrupt officials who think they can steal whatever they want. Sometimes the good guys really do win, and sometimes a simple fence can change everything.